The announcement came like a thunderclap across the global stage. A sitting U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, whose name has already been tied to controversies and deep-rooted debates about influence and ethics, suddenly became linked to a decision that few could have imagined possible. Reports claimed that Thomas had issued an arrest warrant against Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fiery leader of Burkina Faso. But almost as quickly as the news spread, the reaction was swift, fierce, and unlike anything his circle of allies had anticipated. What was intended to be a bold statement of legal and political authority instead spiraled into a storm that backfired on multiple fronts, shaking not just perceptions of U.S. influence, but also global trust in the very institutions that were supposed to stand above political manipulation. To understand why this moment carried such explosive consequences, we must first step back and place it within the broader geopolitical context. Ibrahim Traoré, the military captain who assumed leadership of Burkina Faso in 2022, has steadily grown into one of the most symbolic figures of African resistance against Western dominance. His bold rejection of French military presence, his insistence on retaining control over Burkina Faso's gold and natural resources, and his open embrace of Pan-African solidarity with nations like Mali and Niger have positioned him as both a hero at home and a threat abroad. In the eyes of those determined to preserve Western hegemony, Traoré is not just another African leader, he represents a dangerous precedent, a leader unwilling to bow, unwilling to concede, unwilling to be shaped by outside interests. Judge Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, sits at one of the pinnacles of American judicial authority. His tenure on the Supreme Court has been marked by conservatism, rigidity in interpretation, and most recently, accusations of ethical impropriety linked to powerful financial circles. For his name to be associated with an arrest warrant against a foreign leader raises immediate questions. A U.S. justice issuing such a warrant steps into a realm beyond judicial authority, into the entangled world of geopolitics, influence, and hidden agendas. Whether or not the warrant itself carried genuine legal weight, the symbolism of it was potent enough to stir a hornet's nest. When the news broke, reactions across Africa were instant. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Abuja, commentators, analysts, and ordinary citizens expressed disbelief that a foreign judicial figure would even attempt to extend his authority in such a way. For many Africans, this was not just an attack on Traoré, it was an affront to sovereignty itself. Leaders from across the Sahel quickly closed ranks, declaring that any attempt to detain Traoré would be seen as an attack on all the nations that have stood against neo-colonialism. Mali and Niger issued joint statements of support, while Guinea's transitional leadership went even further, calling the warrant a relic of colonial arrogance dressed in legal disguise. In the West, the picture was more complicated. Some political actors in Washington viewed the move as reckless, even embarrassing, suggesting that it was yet another example of overreach that exposed the fragility of U.S. credibility abroad. Others quietly celebrated it, believing it demonstrated America's willingness to strike hard against figures challenging its interests in Africa. But this duality only underscored the very problem. By targeting Traoré, the decision inadvertently amplified his image as a symbol of resistance, galvanizing support for him, not just in Africa, but across the global South. The backfire effect unfolded quickly. Within hours, social media platforms across Africa lit up with hashtags defending Traoré and mocking what many saw as desperate Western tactics. Hashtags like "Your hands off Traore" and "Orange Africa will decide" began trending across X, TikTok, and Facebook. Online activists compared the warrant to the long history of external attempts to silence African revolutionaries, from Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara. Traoré, still in his 30s, was now being placed in that lineage of leaders who dared to challenge the global order, a status that no American court ruling could ever erase. Behind the scenes, questions about legality also began to surface. What jurisdiction did Clarence Thomas have in issuing an arrest warrant for a sitting African head of state? None, argued constitutional scholars, who quickly pointed out that such an action was not only outside the powers of a U.S. justice, but also undermined the credibility of the court as a whole. If anything, critics argued, it made the Supreme Court appear compromised, an institution weaponized for geopolitical ends rather than upholding impartial justice. The implications for American democracy were profound. If the highest court could be entangled in international political games, what did that say about its independence at home? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso itself, the announcement had an unintended unifying effect. Citizens who might have disagreed with certain aspects of Traoré's governance suddenly found themselves rallying behind him. Protests in Ouagadougou transformed into demonstrations of defiance, with thousands waving flags and chanting slogans of support. For a nation that has endured cycles of instability, coups, and insecurity, the idea that a foreign power sought to criminalize their leader sparked not division, but solidarity. Even those critical of Traoré's military-led government recognized the warrant as an external attack on the nation's sovereignty. On the diplomatic front, the move created headaches for the United States. African leaders who had cautiously engaged with Washington began to question the reliability of U.S. partnerships. The African Union convened an emergency session, with several members pushing for a formal condemnation of what they called judicial overreach. In New York, at the United Nations, African diplomats spoke with renewed urgency about reforming global governance structures, arguing that the warrant only reinforced the imbalance of power between North and South. Ironically, the warrant also deepened cooperation between Burkina Faso and its new allies. Russia, which has been steadily building its presence in the Sahel through security and economic agreements, seized on the moment to reaffirm its support for Traoré. Moscow declared that any attempt to detain or undermine him would be seen as an attack on Africa's sovereign right to self-determination. China, though more cautious, echoed similar sentiments, framing the warrant as another example of unilateralism that undermines international law. In one stroke, what was meant to isolate Traoré instead pushed him further into the embrace of powerful global partners. The longer-term consequences of the backfire are perhaps even more telling. Within weeks of the announcement, Burkina Faso announced new initiatives to expand its gold mining sector, strengthen its energy independence, and accelerate regional integration with Mali and Niger through the alliance of Sahel states. These moves were framed as defiant responses, concrete demonstrations that no foreign warrant could derail the nation's trajectory. For the West, this represented not just a diplomatic embarrassment, but also a strategic setback. Rather than weakening Traoré's influence, the attempt only solidified his standing and expanded his reach. At the heart of the controversy lies a paradox. By seeking to delegitimize Traoré through legal action, his adversaries inadvertently legitimized his narrative that Africa's fight for sovereignty is constantly under threat from external forces unwilling to let go of control. The warrant became a symbol not of Traoré's weakness, but of the desperation of those opposing him. And in politics, perception often outweighs reality. The image of a young African leader standing tall against an institution as powerful as the U.S. Supreme Court only amplified his mystique, his resilience, and his global appeal. For Clarence Thomas, the fallout extended beyond Africa. Critics at home seized on the incident as yet another example of his controversial entanglements, questioning whether his role had been compromised by political or financial interests. Editorials in American media raised concerns about judicial independence, while lawmakers began murmuring about the need for greater accountability within the court. What was supposed to be an act of authority instead highlighted vulnerability, exposing both Thomas and the court to intensified scrutiny. In the end, the attempted arrest warrant for Ibrahim Traoré will likely be remembered less as a legal maneuver and more as a political miscalculation. It demonstrated how misreading the dynamics of African politics can produce the exact opposite outcome of what was intended. It underscored Africa's growing assertiveness in the global arena, its unwillingness to bow to external dictates, and its readiness to rally around figures who embody that spirit. For Traoré himself, the moment has already been cemented into his narrative. He emerges not as a fugitive, but as a survivor of yet another attempted blow against his leadership. To his supporters, each attempt to undermine him, whether through economic sanctions, media campaigns, or now even international warrants, only proves the righteousness of his path. Far from weakening him, such efforts transform him into a living symbol of defiance, an embodiment of Africa's determination to chart its own future. As the dust settles, the episode serves as a reminder of how rapidly the balance of power is shifting. The days when external powers could unilaterally dictate the fate of African leaders are waning. In their place rises a new reality, one in which attempts to suppress sovereignty only ignite deeper resistance, and where figures like Ibrahim Traoré transform external threats into fuel for their legitimacy. What began as a warrant has now become a warning, not to Africa, but to those who underestimate its resolve.